Hello, everybody. L.C. Holt here. Rebecca Ivey and I discussing our problems.
That's right.
This is my update for the week of August the 31st. I got something weird with my hair.
I did too. I just taught a yoga class, if anybody's wondering. So, yeah.
We're live.
We're live.
Look at that. This is sort of a Johnny Bravo thing. I just don't know what it is. It is an eraser head. But before we get into what the show is actually going to be about, it's so weird being live again, sitting next to you.
I know.
No, don't do that. You're freaking out. But anyway, before we get into the subject of what today's show is going to be about, let me tell you that right now, live, the Time's Up Indiegogo campaign has launched. Time's Up is a film co-produced by myself and Damien Maffei from The Strangers Pray at Night, Haunt, and the upcoming Wrong Turn Foundation, starring the two of us, as well as Hannah Fearman from The Vampire Diaries and the VHS, Felissa Rose from Sleepaway Camp, and so many other films, David E. McMahon, Camara Cole, great cast, directed by Corey Norman. I'm going to leave a link in the description of this YouTube video. I want you to go and check out our Indiegogo. You're going to find a ton of perks, exclusive stuff you're only going to get on this campaign. So please check it out and help us make this slasher film extravaganza a reality. We need your help. With that out of the way, I'm going to tell you about something else I'm really excited about. And that's what this show today is going to be about. And that is Twin Peaks. I have been a fan of Twin Peaks since I was a kid. That was the thing. You know, when I heard about that, I was like, oh, I'm going to go in there. There's going to be like chevron floors, like red curtains everywhere.
How were they able to do that?
I don't know. I don't know. Because maybe the youngsters are, the hair is a little David Lynch. So maybe it's appropriate, yes. You know, because David's got that wild hair. But yeah, I mean, when I heard that the Twin Peaks was a restaurant, I was not thinking Twin Peaks like what they're referring to, you know, so the Hooters. I went in there expecting to see like people talking backwards and shit, right. Little people walking around, dancing. None of that.
They're the waiters.
Yeah. None of that. No like Pacific Northwest, Great Northern Hotel. No. It's just Hooters. It's Hooters.
Kyle McLaughlin's your host.
That would be awesome. Like and like the specials were coffee and cherry pie. But anyway.
They missed an opportunity.
Sure did. We talked about David Lynch on a show dedicated to his career, sort of an overview show. But it's kind of hard to talk about Twin Peaks without throwing in a little David Lynch at the beginning. So we'll do a little quick summary.
Recap. Just put a link in the notes.
Well, we can do that too. But I feel
give us views.
I feel it's appropriate to talk a little bit about David's background. He was born, as we said, on the David Lynch show on January 20th, 1946 in Missoula, Montana. Eagle Scout, that David. You never would know it from some of his films, though.
That's right. Did he have the Mounds of Dirt badge?
I don't know, but he needs one. He needs lots of mounds of dirt. He moved to Philadelphia. Some of Twin Peaks is set in Philadelphia, especially Fire Walk with Me. There's a key sequence involving David Bowie that takes place in Philadelphia. We'll get to Fire Walk with me here shortly. He did a couple short films that were really kind of key to his initial success, The Grandmother being probably the most noteworthy, which then led into him getting a fellowship to go to Los Angeles, to AFI, and study. And that's where, over the course of 4 years, he made a movie called Eraserhead in the stables behind AFI. He was kind of squatting there and making this movie. Somehow he pulled that off for 4 years. Eventually got hired by Mel Brooks to direct a movie called The Elephant Man, one of our favorites. Great movie with John Hurt and Anthony Hopkins, amongst many other great actors. Then he did Dune for Dino De Laurentiis, one of really ultimately two movies he did with Dino. Dune was not a huge creative or financial, for that matter, success for David. It was not a fulfilling experience, not one he looks back on fondly, mainly because he did not have Final Cut. He did eventually get Final Cut with the next film he did with Dino, which was Blue Velvet, starring Kyle MacLachlan. Kyle MacLachlan had first worked with David on Dune. He played Paul Atreides in Dune. So that was sort of the start of Kyle's career. They continued to work together. David Lynch and Kyle McLaughlin had sort of an interesting rapport because they were sort of, McLaughlin was kind of like Lynch's counterpart. Mm-hmm. If you look at Blue Velvet, like McLaughlin's character, Jeffrey Beaumont, dresses like David Lynch. He's got the khaki slacks and the button-up black shirt, collared shirt all the way up, to the top, and he looks kind of like David Lynch looked, especially at that time. So I think in some ways David found his muse with Kyle MacLachlan, somebody who could portray that sort of Lynchian innocence. And that I've always said, and I said it on our David Lynch show, that I really feel like Blue Velvet was the proto Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Lumberton in Blue Velvet, kind of, you could see how that evolved into the town of Twin Peaks.
Now, you were telling, this was years ago, so I may be totally remembering this conversation wrong, but you had told me that David Lynch really wanted to do a project about Marilyn Monroe.
Yes.
And that it evolved into Twin Peaks a little bit.
That was one of the things that sort of evolved. I think if you start with Blue Velvet, and then, that movie was a huge success commercially. It was a small movie. I think it was more the kind of the size and speed David Lynch liked. I don't know that he really loved the huge scope of something like Dune, which was a major film, huge location sets, huge cast, a lot of money. I think David seemed to flourish in budget levels like Blue Velvet or The Elephant Man, stuff like that, where at least he could have control, because I don't know if I mentioned prior, he did have final cut on Blue Velvet, though Dino could not put it in the contract. There was a handshake, a gentleman's agreement.
Agreement.
And he stuck by it.
I wish he would have made the Marilyn movie or project, because there needs to be a good movie about Marilyn Monroe. You don't get me started.
You don't think there has been yet?
I don't think there has been. Personally, now I might get some haterade out there, but no.
Yeah, there's been a lot of clunky Marilyn Monroe movies.
Don't even bring up that last one.
I'm not. Oh, you're talking about My Week with Marilyn?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I brought it up. Sorry.
Yes. That source material. Bleh.
Yeah.
And the costumes were great.
Yeah.
I liked the costumes, but except for at the end when he's watching the footage and she's singing, and I'm like, that's not the dress that she wore when she did that number. What the hell is he watching? I'm confused. This is not one of her films. It was just confusing, and I didn't care. I'm getting off topic, but David Lynch, please make a Marilyn movie.
Well, now that we're discussing that, I think it's a good time to go into what David Lynch originally was going to make with Warner Brothers, which was an adaptation of a book called Goddess.
Yes, I have that book, yep.
You like that book?
Oh, I have that book, yes.
Now, David was hired by Warner Brothers to do this movie, to develop it. And he wound up meeting for the first time a screenwriter who had done a lot of television, primarily Hill Street Blues, huge show in its time, a guy named Mark Frost. And David Lynch and Mark Frost began to talk about how they could adapt the book Goddess, which would be the story of Marilyn Monroe's life. And it would go all the way up into her death. It would deal with the weeks prior and then deal with her actual death, which, for those of you who don't know, check out our Marilyn Monroe show. It was a very mysterious death. Many conspiracy theories over the years have developed.
Put the link in the notes.
I will. There's going to be a lot of links in these notes. That was the Marilyn Monroe, and Lynch was really fascinated with the idea of Marilyn Monroe making a film about her life. There was something about a woman who was beautiful, attractive, charismatic. People wanted to be around her, but at the same time, there was a darkness to her.
It's that theme he always goes with, like Mulholland Drive,
right.
The shiny part of Hollywood, and then
that's
the reality.
And it would have been one of his Hollywood films, which up until this time he hadn't done. Later, he would go on to make, as you said, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, sort of a series of Hollywood-themed films. But had he made Goddess in 1986 or thereabouts, it would have been kind of his first Hollywood film, dealing with, the town and the business and, those sorts of dark and light themes, which we all know David loves. But he took this little elements of Goddess and he transferred them over into Twin Peaks when Twin Peaks was eventually made. There's something came in between these two. Goddess fell apart. It did not happen, clearly. So, but David and Mark Frost got together. This is kind of an interesting side note, which I think you might kind of like. They got together and they worked on a separate script, a comedy called One Saliva Bubble. How's that for a title? One Saliva Bubble.
Appetizing.
And it was the story of these guys that were sitting in a electrical power plant, and they were blowing saliva bubbles. And one of these saliva bubbles floats down onto the control pad and pops. And that little bit of saliva activates this weird malfunction in the power plant. And it does electrical surges. And eventually this electrical surge hits a town, an airport, and shocks the people in the town. And suddenly all of their personalities get transferred. So everybody kind of like swaps bodies in the town. There were...
I was going to say, this was like late 80s?
This was late 80s.
It was during that time. Remember the son-father swap movies?
Yes. Yeah, this would have been Mark...
on a bigger scale.
Mark Frost and David Lynch's contribution to that. And it was set to star Steve Martin and Martin Short were going to be the stars of One Saliva Bubble. It was going to be a kind of a big deal comedy because like David Lynch is directing a comedy. What's this going to be?
You pitched it. I'm ready to go rent it.
I'm ready too. I want to see this movie. Unfortunately,
that 80s lingo, rent it.
We're going to have to go to an alternate reality because that movie never happened either. I was like, God, it's just never quite happened. But we are eking ever closer to Twin Peaks because Mark Frost and David Lynch, after One Saliva Bubble fell apart, it was actually going to be produced by Dino De Laurentiis. It was going to be the third film directed by Lynch that was going to be produced by De Laurentiis. Problem was, this is why One Saliva Bubble didn't happen. His company went bankrupt.
Oh.
So it was about to shoot. I mean, they were so close to doing One Saliva Bubble, it's not even funny. But Dino's company folded, and that was the end of it.
It would have been interesting to see him work with Steve Martin.
Yeah, and Martin Short.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to have seen that.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really interesting...
Maybe we can travel to an alternate universe where it happened.
Yes.
And we can see it.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. But anyway, here's the thing. After that movie fell apart, Lynch was looking for work. Someone suggested to Lynch, why don't you do TV? And Lynch was like, tell him I don't want to do TV. No.
It was still there in that era where TV was like the death knell in your film career.
Right. It was, sitcoms, and some were good. And then it was, if it was a mystery show or a cop show, it was very much wrapped up by it was like the Law and Order, like a Law and Order type thing, where you get a body in the first few minutes. Dragnet. And then you research the crime. But by the end of the episode, the bad guy is in jail or whatever, they get away, whatever the resolution
Tidy,
is.
packaged.
Yes. And no continuity from episode to episode. This was before the time of, you had soap operas. And you had things like Peyton's Place, but you didn't have, or Dynasty. That was another kind of at that time, or Dallas. Yeah. You had those sort of primetime shows that were a continuing soap opera. But primarily, you didn't have continuing stories. And mostly that was because of syndication. Because when a show went into syndication, they might air the episodes out of order. So you couldn't get too much into a continuing story because if you aired them out of order, none of it would make sense. So you were always setting up for a syndication package.
See, I'm so non-committal. I like to be able just to watch one single show by itself. So I don't want to commit to the entire show for years. Look, that's me.
There's perks there.
But also Twin Peaks didn't go on for 10 years. You know, it was very,
Well, yeah. We'll get into that, but in Peyton's Place, I mentioned that was a big influence for David Lynch and Mark Frost, because once they started humoring the idea of what if we did do television, David sort of locked on to the concept of what if we did something like a town, like an ensemble. He was really into this like tapestry idea, and Twin Peaks is very much a tapestry. The idea that you wouldn't really have necessarily a lot of main characters, but you would have a ton of supporting players who would all be equally important. And so that's the sort of the Peyton Place direction is where they decided to go.
I'm really surprised he didn't. Well, I'm sure it had been done so much by this point, an anthology show.
Yeah, well, he did kind of try to do that with something that wasn't successful called Hotel Room, a different show. We're not going to go into that, but it's a different show, which I would like to have seen, maybe what he had done with that. He did not do the anthology idea with this. This idea was, I think, born a lot from that era of Dynasty and Dallas. This was going to be like David Lynch's version of that sort of thing.
I remember during that time being a kid, a lot of these shows were coming, like Northern Exposure, Twin Peaks came out. I mean, Northern Exposure was a comedy, but still,
right.
but it was kind of in that early 90s, and then you had, oh gosh, I can't even remember the name of it. David Duchovny was on it.
We talking about
early, was it David?
The X-Files?
No, never mind. We'll move on. I may be totally remembering things wrong. I am getting old, so.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about Twin Peaks, and we're going to talk about how much it changed the television landscape, because a lot of these shows that came after were very influenced by Twin Peaks. In fact, shows even to this day, shows like Lost and so forth, have been highly influenced by Twin Peaks, but we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves if we talk about that first. I want to talk about another image that popped into David's head around the same time that he had the idea of doing a show based in a town, a small town. And that was the idea. He had an image of a woman dead, wrapped in plastic. And for any of you who know Twin Peaks and are a fan of the show, you know that image. That is an indelible image from the very first pilot episode, because that woman wrapped in plastic actually became a teenage girl named Laura Palmer. I think Laura Palmer has elements in common with Marilyn Monroe and how he was interested in portraying Marilyn Monroe. That said, Lynch has said that is not Marilyn Monroe. Laura Palmer is not meant to be Marilyn Monroe with the name changed. But he thought he saw Marilyn Monroe as being what he called a woman in trouble. And that was something that carried over into Laura Palmer. Laura Palmer is a woman in trouble. And she is someone who on the surface appears to be this high school dream. She's beautiful, she's blonde, everyone seems to love her. She is the girl in school. But if you look beneath the surface, she has a lot of things going on, and she has many, many troubles and problems. And there's a darkness there, She is involved with a lot of sketchy people. She is a cocaine addict, and she is having a lot of sex, particularly over at the old Roadhouse with Jacques and all the rest of them, and Leo Johnson. And she's got all kinds of problems. But I think this stems primarily from her home life. Yeah. We won't go into exactly what that is, because we're going to reveal who killed Laura Palmer. You guys already know it's been 25-something years, right? But we're going to reveal it for those of you who don't know. Like 2, maybe. Like half of a person doesn't know this. But anyway, Laura was living a deadly double life, is what I'm trying to tell you about that character. And she wound up dead, wrapped in plastic, found by Pete Martell, played by the inimitable Jack Nance.
Don't be hanging out at the Roadhouse.
Don't go there. Jack Nance, the star of Eraserhead, finds Laura Palmer in the opening scene where he's going fishing, and he doesn't make it to his fishing excursion because there she is laying on the roadside. This draws the attention of the FBI because similar murders, at least one similar murder, the murder of a woman named Teresa Banks, who was young like Laura from a neighboring town. There are a lot of similarities between the murder of Laura Palmer and Teresa Banks. Special Agent Dale Cooper, played by Mclaughlin, a man who loves hot black coffee and cherry pie, comes to Twin Peaks to see what the connection between these two murders is. He winds up meeting the town sheriff, Sheriff Harry Truman, along with several deputies, including Deputy Hawk and Andy. Andy, oh man, we gotta love Andy. Andy's hair is almost as crazy as mine. Not quite. And there's Lucy, who works at the sheriff's department. She's the receptionist. Throughout that pilot episode, you meet a lot of the citizens of Twin Peaks. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just there's a Instagram page that I follow, and this lady, it's called Kitten Lady, and she fosters kittens. And her last batch of kittens, she named every kitten after a Twin Peaks character.
Is that right?
So there was Hawk and Lucy,
Yeah.
and you got to watch them grow up until they were adopted. So yeah,
That's fantastic.
so yeah, I was like, it's my Twin Peaks kittens.
This would have been. This sounds like something I would have done. Because you know how crazy I am about Twin Peaks.
Yes.
Now, ABC liked the idea of this. They weren't entirely in love with the pilot, but they went with it. They hired David Lynch and Mark Frost to write the script, which took them 10 days. But you have to keep in mind, they'd been discussing this idea for like 3 months. So when they got the go-ahead to write the script, it was like, shh, they were ready to go. $4 million was put up for the production of this pilot, but they had a conditional idea with this. They thought, well, okay, look, if we can arrange a deal for theatrical distribution in Europe, then we can cover our bases. So if this show doesn't get picked up for pilot, let's get David to close the story, close the loop, do a third act, wrap it up as if it were a feature film. And then if it doesn't go to series, we can release it as a feature film in Europe and make our money back. So this was the idea. So they were sort of hedging their bets a little bit. Not a bad idea.
Yeah.
And so that was.
I mean, because how many times have movies a series has been started and then they don't finish it, and
right.
then you're like, what happened?
Right. And I mean, if you think about it, it's not a bad idea for a lot of pilots, because if it doesn't go to series, at least you didn't waste all that money and time and energy, because a lot of money goes into making these pilots. $4 million in 1987 ain't no chump change. So anyway, that was their idea of how to make their money back, just in case it didn't go through as a TV show. The execs, once the pilot was completed, it was directed by David Lynch, written, as I said before, by he and Frost. They looked at the pilot and they did not quite know what to make of it. It was so different than the stuff that was on TV at the time. This was not Dallas or Dynasty, even though it had a kind of a tip in the hat to that genre of a continuing kind of soap opera story, because don't get me wrong, Twin Peaks has soap opera elements. It definitely has that thing, but it's in a David Lynch world.
Yeah.
It's not primetime soaps like what people were used to. And the execs were like, I don't know what to make of this. So they showed it to some focus groups, and they actually responded well. Wasn't over the top, but they were like, oh, this is interesting. It was enough to make the executives go, oh, okay, breathe a little sigh of relief. So they decided to go ahead and take it to series. Of course, they had that ending, the wrapped up ending. They had already shot it, So they had that. And it was released as theatrically in Europe as a film. But in America, the show went forward, and they put out an order for 7 episodes, and it would premiere in the spring of 1990. That was going to be, it was like a mid-season type thing.
I do have a question. Now, the theatrical release that was in Europe, can you see it?
Yes.
How different is it from what we saw?
It's similar in so much as the killer of Laura Palmer is revealed to be Bob. But the other element, the added elements, are not there.
Okay.
Leland is not there.
Okay.
In terms of the conclusion. He's in the show, but not involved with the murder.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
Okay.
But Bob is also a physical being in the pilot, in the wrapped up pilot, whereas Killer Bob in the show, as you know, is an incorporeal sort of entity.
Okay.
Okay. But
that's interesting.
it's not a bad idea, actually. I don't know why more pilots don't do that.
Yeah.
Just to cover your base.
Can you get it here? I mean,
you can.
Film?
Yes, you can get it where it's the pilot. And Lynch, he directed the first couple episodes of Twin Peaks once they got the series order. But shortly thereafter, he had to go and shoot Wild at Heart, the film. More information on that. Watch our David Lynch show.
That's right. Link in the notes in the description.
So he sort of left it to Mark Frost there for a few minutes. Now let's talk about some of the casting. Cheryl Lee was Laura Palmer. So good. Yeah. One of the most incredible screams I think I've ever heard from anybody. Talk about a scream queen. Laura Palmer's scream and all of this is amazing. But this show had a lot of really talented actors. Like this was I think a lot of people wanted to work with Lynch. It wasn't that it was TV. They didn't really care. It was just, we get to work with Lynch. He's so interesting. Like, let's do this. Like Piper Laurie, was regular on the show.
Well, this is also, like I said, before this, really, I mean, it was, TV, death and nail in my film career.
Like we don't do that.
And in the 90s, it started to kind of,
Well, what was cool is that all these people got to be involved in this mystery plot because everybody was a suspect. Piper Laurie as Catherine Martell, Pete's wife. Could she have done it? I don't know. She's got something weird going on with the mill. She's trying to take that away from Josie Packard, and there's that whole internal struggle within the town with the mill and everything. Russ Tambler, who played Dr. Jacoby. He definitely was a huge suspect because he was Laura's psychiatrist. And he seemed to have an interesting sort of fascination with Laura. And was there more to it? Was there a sexual element?
Was that inspired by Marilyn and her psychiatrist?
Yeah, I think actually I think Jacoby could have been a huge Marilyn Monroe. Yeah, I think that was probably something you could have transferred straight over from Goddess and did. Warren Frost, great actor, who played the town's doctor, medical doctor. Peggy Lipton, Al Strobel, who was the one-armed man, which is a straight-up reference to The Fugitive. Because what is the character's name? The one-armed man in Twin Peaks? Gerard, which is again a reference to The Fugitive. Was the federal marshal's name in The Fugitive? So there were a lot of hat tipping going on there. And let's talk for a minute about, I mentioned before Bob, let's talk about Frank Silva. This is the way Killer Bob came about. He was not originally a part of the pilot script. Killer Bob came about because on the set of Twin Peaks, there was a set dresser named Frank Silva. And David Lynch was getting ready to shoot something in Laura Palmer's house. And Frank Silva was moving around some furniture. And Lynch's back was to him, and he moved a chest of drawers in front of a door. And Lynch said he heard a woman's voice say, "Hey, Frank, be careful. You don't want to lock yourself in that room," because he had moved the chest in front of the drawer. And David Lynch said he got an image of Frank Silva locked in Laura Palmer's bedroom. And this inspired him to create Killer Bob. So he went up to Frank Silva, the set dresser, and he said, "Hey, Frank, are you an actor?" And Frank was like, yeah, I could be an actor.
Never turn down an opportunity, folks.
Absolutely not, because it might end to some career-defining thing like this, because everyone knows Killer Bob. But Lynch said, "Great, you're going to be in this." And so he had Frank Silva get down at the base of Laura's bed and just hide, where you just saw his eyes and that crazy long hair of his, and you saw it just peeking over the bed just a little bit. And then he panned the camera across the room, so you just saw that little image of Frank down there. And then he was like, "Okay, great." Didn't know what he was going to do with it, but he got the shot. And then later that night, they were filming in the living room of Laura's house. And the great Grace Zabriskie, who plays Sarah Palmer, Laura's mother, there's a scene at the end of the pilot where she has a nightmare and she wakes up on the couch and screams. She's in a sitting position and she jerks forward. And David Lynch shot that and thought it would look great, captured the screen perfectly. And then the DP came over and said, "David, we're going to have to do it again." And Lynch was like, "But it was great. It was perfect screen. I mean, I love it." And the guy said, "No, we can't, because somebody was reflected in that mirror back there." And Lynch said, "Who was reflected?" And the DP said, "Frank Silva."
Well, wasn't that a lucky?
Yes, because
or maybe he planned it.
Maybe he snuck his little ass in there.
He's like, "Well,
I'm gonna get my hair in this twice." I got my hair in this. Look at this, David Lynch. Weird, Johnny Bravo. But anyway, yes, and so that's how Frank Silva and Killer Bob came to be. Totally fortuitous, unless Frank snuck in there.
Yes.
But either way, wonderful, because Killer Bob has survived with the series, even beyond Frank Silva's unfortunate death. Even going into season 3, Frank is very present in there, because you can't get away from Killer Bob. Angelo Bad Lamenta, who had worked with David Lynch on Blue Velvet, came back to work with him on the series, doing the incredible score. Julie Cruz did an album in which a lot of the tunes, including the famous theme song.
I love that theme song.
Yeah, I love it too.
As a kid, because I was a small kid at that
Mhm.
time. The show scared me and freaked me out. It was just too weird for me because I wasn't old enough to understand it really.
Yeah.
But I'd love to like watch I used to do that. I'd watch opening credits and then leave the room or
Yeah.
change the channel. And that was one of the shows I always just loved to sit there and just watch the theme song. And then I would go in the other room and play with my toys.
And I don't think that you were, you didn't know that it was actually set to lyrics.
Yeah, I didn't.
Because I showed you I let you listen to the album,
Yeah.
Julie Cruz album that Lynch wrote the songs for, Angelo Bad Lamenta wrote the music for, and Julie Cruz sung. And there is a song called Falling.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the Twin Peaks theme song set to lyrics. So if you ever want to, it's sort of like the MASH theme song. A lot of people didn't know that had lyrics,
Very dark.
Yeah, Suicide is Painless. Well, if you want to hear the lyrics for the Twin Peaks theme song, it's a song called Falling by Julie Cruz. Very good song. Now, this gets a little complicated when we start getting into the mythology of the show. The famous Red Room was conceived by David Lynch after the writing of the pilot. It's amazing to think that like the Black Lodge and the Red Room and all that wasn't a part of it from the very beginning. But a lot of this came about through David Lynch getting ideas and inspirations throughout shooting the thing, like Frank Silva.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who would have thought Frank Silva wasn't always just Bob? The character Bob wasn't always there. The Red Room came about because David Lynch was trying to think of a way to wrap up the pilot for the European theatrical release. And he was standing by a car, and he had his hands on top of the car, and he said the top of the car was hot. And he said as he was standing there with his hands on the top of this warm car, the idea of the Red Room came into his mind. All these people talking backwards and shit, the floor, the chevron floor, all of that. And then they put up the set and he shot that stuff that eventually, they didn't use it in the pilot because it was open-ended for series. But all the stuff he shot for the theatrical actually wound up, I think it was in episode 3 of the first season. They use it as a dream sequence that Agent Del Cooper has, in which Laura Palmer comes to him and whispers into his ear and tells him who kills her. And he gets a number of other clues also during this dream as to who killed Laura Palmer. But the one thing he can't remember when he wakes up is what Laura whispered to him. The one thing that he needs, who killed me? Yes, the most important thing is the only thing Del Cooper cannot remember. Michael J. Anderson, of course, the little person who played the man from another place, who we later discover is the one-armed man's missing arm. I am the arm. He speaks backwards. And actually, Michael J. Anderson, it's interesting because he, as a kid, used to do that. He learned how to speak phonetically backwards as a way of, I guess, entertaining his friends and whatnot. And so he helped a lot of the actors learn how to do their lines phonetically backwards because that's how they did it. They would do it phonetically backwards, and then when they played it forward, it would give this weird, dreamy distortion. And usually it was the actual inhabitants of the Red Room that talk backwards. Like, for instance, when Del Cooper talks while he's in there, it's not backwards. But if you're from that place, if you're from the lodge, because as you learn on the show, there are 2 lodges. There's the Black Lodge, which is a place of horror and evil and anger, pain and suffering. And then there is the White Lodge, in which, it is the exact reverse of that. It's peace, it's love, it's tranquility. So and then in between, there's the waiting room, which is where Del Cooper finds himself.
Like heaven, hell, and purgatory.
Pretty much, yeah. And that when you go into the Black Lodge, it's not necessarily forever, but it's this sort of purification process in which you eventually make your way to the White Lodge, is sort of the idea. But a lot of the inhabitants, the actual inhuman inhabitants of the Black Lodge, are purely evil. People like Bob or the Arm. And there are also doppelgangers that exist in the Black Lodge, apparently for everyone, but only a few characters actually meet their evil doppelganger. Now, all of this obviously is revealed throughout the course of the show. Despite what a lot of the executives thought, from premiere on, people were hooked. The viewing audience, for some reason, took to Twin Peaks how unusual it was, and they ran with it. There were watch parties going on at people's houses every week to see what was going to happen next on this crazy show. And ultimately, the idea was always the question on everyone's lips was, well, who killed Laura Palmer? Everybody wanted to know. And every week you got more clues heading in that direction. The original idea, however, was that you would never find out. That's what David Lynch sort of sold the show as, a continuing mystery. As it begins with Laura wrapped in plastic. Who killed her? That's the question. But as the show was to go on, that question would remain a forever mystery. And all these other, and it would sort of fade into the background a bit, and all these other storylines would come into the show, and you'd get involved with the people's lives. This was the initial concept. But always hovering over it was going to be the murder of Laura Palmer and who killed her. That was the conception. This is not unusual, I don't think, because David Lynch loves the idea of a mystery that's not solved. Mm-hmm. So this was just going to be what he does in his films now. That would be in the TV show. It would just be long form, but you would never really know. He said maybe at the very end. Yeah. When the show the last episode, 6-7 seasons down the line, you might reveal who killed Laura Palmer. David was very loyal, though. He cast a lot of his friends from AFI. He gave them jobs as directors on the series because he did not direct every episode. He couldn't. He had to go do Wild at Heart and a number of other things. But they had some really big-name directors who worked on Twin Peaks, who would eventually become big-name directors. So that the season 1, as I said, was 7 episodes. It ended on a cliffhanger in which Del Cooper answers his door at the Great Northern and gets shot by an unseen person. And that's how the show ended. This was the time of cliffhangers, who shot JR,
Yeah.
Who shot Del Cooper? And then you had this really interesting opening. David Lynch directed the opening of season 2. People had to wait all summer to find out who shot, Kyle McLaughlin's Del Cooper. He was laying on the floor that whole time. My grandmother was so funny. When she would watch soap operas and someone would get shot on a Friday, she didn't understand the productions and stuff. On Monday morning, this was my great grandmother actually. She would say on Monday morning, "Oh, look at that poor man. He's been laying there all weekend." She thought he just laid there, the actor, But yeah, and that's but so I guess Del Cooper was laying there all summer, and then season 2 picked up, and you got to find out. Not immediately. It took you a little bit to find out who shot Del Cooper, but you had a really weird opening episode where, like, the whole first act of the show was Del laying on the floor of his room, and this old man who's a waiter comes in and he's delivering him warm milk, and like the whole first 10 minutes of the show is this old man comes in and he's like, "Are you all right down there? Okay, bye." And he's like, just leaves Del laying on the floor bloody.
I wonder how many people that frustrated. They waited all summer.
Yeah, and then still had to wait.
Yeah.
I think the show at this point was still doing pretty good with like the little teasing, and as long as you made it funny and weird, and people would kind of go along with it. The problem came really the first half of the season. Season 2 is really good, but the problem came halfway through because the executives at ABC, they had a terrible idea. The biggest mistake of all mistakes having to do with Twin Peaks. Maybe ultimately looking back on it all, it wasn't so bad, but at the time it was catastrophic. They told David Lynch and Mark Frost, they said, "We're going to need to wrap up the mystery. We don't think it can go on forever. Let's wrap it up." And the show will go on, but you guys can come up with another story. I think people need to know now who killed Laura. And David was like, "No, that's terrible. It's going to be a terrible idea. I do not like that idea." Mark Frost was not into the idea either. But, these were the money people, and they were signing the checks. And amazingly, they swayed the producers of the show to take that route. And so halfway through the second season, it was revealed the killer of Laura Palmer was indeed Bob, but he was not just Bob, because this entire time Bob had been possessing Laura's father, Leland, played by Ray Wise, the great Ray Wise, who's fantastic on this show, and that Bob had been making Leland rape his own daughter and sexually assault her, and then ultimately murder her. And that's who killed Laura Palmer. Bob killed Laura Palmer through the guise of Leland Palmer. Now, the problem with that also, or it's sort of an intriguing idea, is how much of that was Bob? Like, was Bob bringing out the worst in Leland? Did Leland have these sort of aspects? You know, did he have this desire toward his own daughter? That's a mystery, you know, and I think it's probably good that that part wasn't solved. It gives you something to think about. What wasn't good about all this solving shit is that the audience dropped. Like, once they found out who killed Laura Palmer, they were like, oh, okay. And then the show went into its second season, admittedly without David Lynch, because once the secret was revealed, Lynch stepped away. Like, it was almost like Lynch just totally lost interest in the show. This led to a lot of resentment amongst particularly the main cast members. Kyle McLaughlin and Lynch, despite their collaborations, had a bit of a falling out because McLaughlin said, look, you left me alone. We were a rudderless ship after the second half of the second season. And he really took it personally. Other people did too. Cheryl Lee Finn, who played Audrey Horne. She did not like the fact that David stepped away in the second half of the season. And then the show started to get weird. I mean, that's when they brought in a character, Kenneth Welsh played him well, but it was just this weird character named Wyndham Earl, who was Dale Cooper's former partner and mentor. And it come to find out that Dale Cooper had an affair with Wyndham's wife, and Wyndham murdered her, and it was something and Dale didn't catch him.
You set up the whole premise of the show as Laura.
Yes. And now that's over.
Gone.
It's over. Yeah. And then you're trying to desperately bring in things. You had there was some weird stuff going on with Dale Cooper, and Dale Cooper had a bit of an attraction to Audrey Horne, and Audrey, Cheryl Lee Finn's character, she had a similar attraction to Dale. McLaughlin said he vetoed that idea of them two getting together because he said it was creepy. He said, Dale Cooper is a grown man. He's an FBI agent. He's coming to this town. I don't want to play him so that he's having an affair with an 18-year-old girl.
And if he's coming to this town to solve this mystery, why is he hanging around?
Well, that was another huge thing they had to solve. Once Laura Palmer's murder was solved, It was like, well, why is Dale here?
Yeah.
And so they went into this weird thing where it was like, you know, Cooper loved the fresh air and all that. This was set up all the way throughout.
Yeah.
So it just sort of became this thing like, well, maybe I'll buy a house here, you know? And it didn't really make any sense. When they brought Wyndham Earl to the town, you sort of went, oh, okay, well, here's a new villain, and he's got to find Wyndham Earl, and now Wyndham Earl's in Twin Peaks. But it didn't really make a whole lot of sense why Dale would stay around long term.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the show in probably a couple of decades, so I remember, you know, the murder. I remember all the things leading up, him finding out. But I do remember it went on. But I always like, why was he? I remember thinking that, why is he hanging around?
The stuff, and there was a lot
over.
Move on. That I think. Well, and see, that's what made sense with Laura Palmer. As long as her investigation is open, he can be there indefinitely.
Yeah.
Now it became really weird. So they started throwing in things like Big Ed Hurley's, you know, wife got conked on the head, and she thought she was a cheerleader, and she had to go to high school, and she fell in love with the Mike from high school, and so he was weirded out because she's a grown. It was weird. It was a lot of stuff.
Kyle McLaughlin was like,
he was not pleased.
David,
yes,
I'll kill you. You got me into this. It was good. Then you left.
Well, once Kyle McLaughlin vetoed the idea of Dale Cooper getting with the teenage girl, they did bring in a love interest for him that was around his own age, played by Heather Graham, and a character named Annie Blackburn. And she figured into the finale of the show well. It wasn't necessarily originally meant to be a series finale. It was meant to be a season finale. But the ratings dropped off to such a degree after the murder of Laura Palmer was solved, that the show basically was shot as if it was going to go into a third season, but it didn't make it there. It was canceled. But David Lynch did return to direct the final episode, and it was a fantastic final episode. I mean, David Lynch really came back strong and righted the ship in a lot of ways, but it was too late. Now,
the people that were like, let's go ahead and solve this, and then it tanks. I mean, are they ever held accountable, or are they still making bad decisions and meddling?
They're probably still making bad decisions and meddling. There is sort of let's talk for a second about the final. Let's talk about the final episode, the Great Cliffhanger, the infamous cliffhanger. In the final episode, Wyndham Earle, the whole idea of Wyndham Earle's character is he's trying to access the Black Lodge, this place of pain, suffering, and horror, because he thinks he can harness the power of the Black Lodge and become all-powerful, an all-powerful entity. Because Wyndham Earle is all into the occult and stuff. That's all built into his character. Mm-hmm. And so what he discovers there is a way to enter the Black Lodge through Ghostwood Forest there in Twin Peaks. You have to go to a certain place where there is a little pit in the ground that has a substance in it that smells like burnt motor oil. There are 10 baby sycamore trees around this. And that if you go to this place and bring with you pain, suffering, and horror at a certain time of the night, on a certain day, the curtains of the Black Lodge will appear and you'll be able to enter into it. And so what happens is Wyndham Earle captures Dale Cooper's love interest, Annie Blackburn, played by Heather Graham, and takes her there, and the curtains to the lodge open, and he goes inside the lodge. Dale, in search of Annie, trying to get her back because he carries Annie with him into the lodge. Dale runs into the lodge in pursuit and winds up in the lodge. Wyndham Earle does not get what he wants. Bob kills Wyndham Earle and takes basically his soul, is what happens. But now Dale Cooper is trapped inside the lodge, and he doesn't know how to get back out. Annie Blackburn actually manages to get out of the lodge, but she's in a terrible comatose state, which she remains in indefinitely, unfortunately, as we later discovered with Mark Frost's books that came later. But Dale Cooper is trapped in the lodge, and he remains in the lodge, but he meets his evil doppelganger, the evil Dale Cooper. And that doppelganger is who leaves the lodge. So the good Dale is trapped. The bad Dale gets out of the lodge and returns to Twin Peaks. And because he looks exactly the same, everyone assumes that that's Dale Cooper. So at the last episode of the show, you see Dale Cooper wake up with Sheriff Truman there, and he goes into the bathroom, and he's going to brush his teeth, and he looks at himself in the mirror, and then you see on the other side of the mirror, Evil Bob, because Evil Bob has left the Black Lodge in the body of evil Dale Cooper. And he slams his head into the mirror and bloodies his scalp. And then as they're asking, are you okay in there? You hear Dale Cooper saying, where's Annie? Where's Annie? It's referring to Annie Blackburn and laughing. And that's how the show ended, with evil Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks and good Dale Cooper trapped in the Black Lodge. Sounds like a great setup for season 3, don't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, season 3 never came. It was canceled long before that aired, but they aired it anyway. So it was this infamous cliffhanger that people talked about for years and years and years, because it's like, man, we love this show. Suddenly you had this great episode directed by one of the co-creator. It's like, wow, we're really righting this ship. And then over. Yeah. It wasn't entirely over in the sense that a couple years later in 1992, David Lynch parlayed the success of the TV show into a film, which was both primarily a prequel, but also somewhat a sequel, called Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. And it dramatized basically the last 7 days of the life of Laura Palmer. It was not a hugely successful show or movie. In fact, it kind of tanked. Because I think in some respects, the fans of Twin Peaks, I don't know that they wanted a prequel. I think they wanted to know what happened to evil Dale Cooper.
Yeah.
Like what happened. And, it ties back into the conclusion in some ways. There's a scene where Laura Palmer is laying in bed, and the ghost of Annie Blackburn comes out of wherever she is and gives a clue to Laura. Says, write down in your diary, the good Dale is trapped in the lodge and he can't get out. So that is a tie-in to the conclusion of the show. And it does play into season 3, what would ultimately become season 3. But other than that, it's pretty much the story of Laura Palmer. I think a lot of people looked at it and they thought, we already know all this.
Yeah.
All of this was already told throughout the course of the series. So what we're watching now is basically knowing what happens. We're going to watch how it all plays out. Don't get me wrong. There's some really good stuff in Fire Walk with Me, and there's some awfully jumbled up, muddled stuff that I don't think plays very. The David Bowie sequence, for instance, is not good because you don't know what the hell is going on. If you watch years later, they released, because the first cut of Fire Walk with Me was over 3 hours long, and they cut and they had to take out a lot of stuff. Most of the people who you grew to love in Twin Peaks, the townspeople, aren't even featured in the movie. They're not even there.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot of what people thought was missing. The humor of the show was gone, and it became this really dark, psychosexual sort of nightmare about this damaged young woman who is being molested by her father, and she's strung out on cocaine and she's having horrible nervous breakdowns. It was really intense, and it wasn't intense in the way that the show was. It wasn't fun in that way, And so anyway, years later, they released The Missing Pieces, Twin Peaks: The Missing Pieces, and that was basically an hour and a half of all the deleted footage, and you got to see like the full David Bowie sequence, which was a great sequence. Mm-hmm. Which in the actual theatrical cut of the movie is rendered incomprehensible. You have no idea what's going on. But had you left that scene intact, I think you would have really, movie would have benefited. There were other scenes, like you got to see Leland and Sarah Palmer with Laura back in happier days, and before he started to go wonky. And I think that would have benefited the movie, because as you see it now, he's already kind of nuts and crazy, and she's kind of terrified of it. But if you had seen that A-B, light and dark, I think it would have been better, Kyle Mclaughlin, after feeling abandoned during the second season of the show, opted out of a large role in the movie. He didn't want to get typecast as Dale Cooper, and he was still kind of sore with David Lynch. So his role is very small compared to the show. He only is in a few scenes. In fact, a part that was written for Dale Cooper, sort of an opening section in which an FBI agent looks into the murder of Teresa Banks, is recast with Chris Isaac, the singer, played a different character, Chester Desmond, who that was originally supposed to be Dale Cooper. But when McLaughlin was like, I don't want to be in this much of this thing, they changed that. And so Chris Isaac stepped in and played him,
Yeah.
He's not Cooper, but he sort of is.
Yeah.
He's a Cooper-esque character. Yeah. Laura Flynn Boyle from the show refused to come back. She was replaced by Maura Kelly as Donna Hayward in the movie. Richard Beamer, who played Ben Horn, did not want to come back. Sherilyn Fenn did not want to come back. She was pissed. Number one, Audrey didn't get to have Dale Cooper relationship in the show, which she didn't like. And number two, she was angry at David Lynch for the same reason Kyle McLaughlin was. So that, so Audrey is not in the movie, for instance. Mark Frost also had a bit of a falling out with Lynch, and he did not return to write Fire Walk with Me. This sounds like a horrible mixture of this sounds like something that maybe shouldn't have been done. I mean, there's a lot of
that's
Fire.
What I'm thinking. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, everybody said, I don't want to do Fire Walk with Me, but a guy named Robert Engel, who wrote for the show, worked with David Lynch on the script. But Mark Frost was out. He didn't want to do it. So, my feelings about the prequel/sequel movie, I don't hate it. I think it has a lot of merit to it. For something that was sort of doomed in a lot of ways, conceptually.
Yeah.
I think
That's a lot of restrictions. You've set up all these characters, all this stuff, and then no one wants to come back. And then you're like, you've got to write around all of this.
right. And then you wind up with a cut that's so long you have to cut that in half.
Yeah.
It's really amazing that it's comprehensible at all.
Yeah.
Because, like I say, there are things in it that could have been clearer had you left the whole scene intact, like the David Bowie stuff, like some of the family stuff. But with what you have, I think Fire Walk with Me has beautiful cinematography, has great music by Angelo Bad Lamenta, and has elements of it that are wholly unforgettable. The actual murder scene itself with Laura Palmer is sad and dark and violent and very tragic, but also in a way it has a sense of triumph, because throughout the movie, what you realize is that Killer Bob really wants to inhabit Laura Palmer. He's inside Leland, but what he wants to get inside Laura. So in the last moments of her life, Laura has a decision to make. There is this owl ring, and if she puts that ring on, it'll somehow protect her. But the one-armed man manages to give her the ring at the last moment, and Laura puts it on, and in the last throes of her life, denies Bob entry into her. So she actually is victorious. She beats Bob. Bob is not able to get into her because of the final choice that she makes. And so that's why he kills her, because if I can't have you, I'm going to murder you. And so that's why Laura Palmer died, is because Bob could not get inside of her. When we go into further, like when we do our season 3 show, which that's a show unto itself, we'll go into more about the origin that is revealed of Laura Palmer, how she's tied to Bob, why Bob perhaps wanted to infiltrate her, and a lot of other stuff, because season 3 was pretty amazing. That came about 25 years after, which is funny because in the final episode of the show, remember, Laura Palmer says, "I'll see you again in 25 years." And I said, "Meanwhile," and then screams at him. Yeah. But sure enough, 25 years after Laura Palmer said that, in the final episode of the TV show, they made the revival series, or the revival series premiered anyway. Twin Peaks: The Return on Showtime. And it was on Showtime, not ABC, which meant they could go all out if they wanted to. The amazing thing about season 3 is they don't go all out in the same way that the TV show did, or that the movie did. Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
Fire Walk with Me, I think maybe went all out a little too much. A little much for some of the show folks, There's a good balance, I think, in season 3. And I do think you need a little bit of that Mark Frost to, I think he and David Lynch together are the soul of Twin Peaks. Mm-hmm. Perhaps Mark Frost not being involved with the writing on Fire Walk with Me, I think that shows a bit. Because as much of Twin Peaks is David Lynch, I would say, 60% for sure, if not more. But you have to have that Mark Frost element as well, in my opinion. And then it really becomes Twin Peaks. They offset each other very, very well. Now, there are certain things that actors that did not return for the revival, and I guess we'll get into that more when we do the season 3 show. That's about all we have for today's show in terms of Twin Peaks season 1, season 2, and Fire Walk with Me. And we could do so many more of these Twin Peaks shows, going deep into the mythology, because even more than Lynch movies, Twin Peaks is something you can deep dive into just because there's so many hours of it. Imagine if you had that many hours of a David Lynch movie, as deep as David Lynch can go into mystery and enigma in 2 hours with something like Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
Twin Peaks you could go on in loops forever. About all the different entities and the convenience store and the people who live above it, and Garmonbosium, and what does this mean? What is the ring? Is the ring that Laura put on, is that good? Is that bad? All we know is that at the end of Fire Walk with Me, she is smiling when she's in the red room, and she sees the angel, which she thought that had abandoned her. So you had that nice moment after Laura beat Bob, where you see her and maybe she has a chance to have peace now or to move on. In some ways that was negated in season 3 to some extent, but we'll go into that later. A lot of people really liked that ending of Fire Walk With Me. They thought it was a good conclusion because it ended Laura's story in a way. It showed her, at least she was smiling at the end, and she was happy, which she was never happy in life, it seemed.
Yeah.
As much as she tried, with this guy, with Bobby Briggs, and with this guy, with Hurley, and then, with Jacoby. And there was that nice man with Meal on Wheels, the shut-in that she wanted to be, he was really sweet to her. She was trying her best to find some semblance of peace. And apparently she found it in the afterlife. Or did she? I don't know. We'll have to discuss that when we talk about the return. So anyway, that's our Twin Peaks show. Rebecca, thank you for being on board once again. You guys, thank you for watching. And don't forget, as I said before, the Time's Up Indiegogo campaign has launched. As of right now, as of today, it's going to be such an amazing slasher movie. It's co-produced by myself and Damien Maffei, directed by Corey Norman, starring so many people. You got to go to the page. I'll link it down in the description. Go there, support this film, help us make a fantastic horror film, because that's what we want to make for you guys. So on that note, we'll have more Twin Peaks in another time. Next week, we'll have another great show. Rebecca, thank you. Guys watching, guys and gals, thank you. And until next time, take care of yourselves.